issues for the upcoming legislative season, and then we will have time for public comment and discussion. So we'll start by asking Mr. Juan Starrett to share a presentation with us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the board. And I'm, as the chair said, I'm Tawana Starrett. I'm the Director of Legislative and Government Affairs for the school board. And I'm just going to share my screen so we can start. Can you see it? No, let me pull it up again. See, I had it all set, and of course, it didn't work. I had this. I apologize. I did have it set up, and I don't know why it's not showing up on your.
You just had it actually. We saw your screen.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. You see the open share tray?
Yeah, I'm hitting that. Here we go. Is that working? No.
Hold up, there might be a lag. I don't see it working yet. But if you just hit open share tray and then desktop, it should, or window should show presentation.
Yeah, it's showing on my screen. I don't know why it's not showing up. Let me close out everything and then go back to it.
If you like, I can share for you. You can just tell me when to click. Let me just try one more thing here. No. Do you see it? Yeah, it's not working on my end. I don't know why. So can you, Christian, pull it up? I appreciate it. Okay, is that working?
Yeah, I can see that. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So just tell me when to switch.
Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. It was acting weird this morning, and during their staff meeting, I pulled it up, but it's not pulling up now. So I'm just going to go through overall just the development of the legislative platform, as well as some of the major issues that I foresee coming up this legislative session. And good evening, Madam CEO. I see you there now. So, Christian, next slide. So I wanted to mention that in the development of the platform, this is the public input. It's the formal forum for the board. But please know, and I want the public to know, that the school board, the CEO, myself, other members of the school staff, they all receive input information throughout the year about suggestions and recommendations to the legislative platform. But this is just the formal time to provide those recommendations, but they can come at any time throughout the year. So this platform was developed with meetings with elected officials throughout the year, the Maryland Association of Boards of Education, Commissioner Bondima and I represent the school board at legislative committee meetings for MABE, and that's the Maryland Association of Boards of Education in short. Also, I meet with my colleagues from MABE on a weekly basis, and we discuss upcoming legislative activities and potential legislation for the coming year. And those are mostly on statewide issues. The same with PZAM. I hear from the PZAM executive director periodically about things that the superintendents are thinking of introducing and or issues that the superintendents have. I met with the Associated Student Congress of Baltimore City just last week, and we had a very good meeting about potential legislative activities. Many of the things that they discussed were things that could be developed at the local level, meaning with the school system. They were very concerned about having career counseling. That came up a lot. Also having a curriculum or a course devoted to different types of careers. They also wanted more funding for tutoring, and especially in the virtual and or face-to-face tutoring. One thing they didn't mention, but I prompted them to bring up, was about student voting rights, because I heard the rumor that there was a push to have the Baltimore City student have full voting rights. And so they said that was something that they were considering. I mentioned that they should talk this over with the board leadership as well as myself about how they see this happening. Just so the board knows, in Maryland, Anne Arundel County is the only school board that has a student member with full voting rights. People assume Montgomery County is the other, but that student does not have full voting rights. He or she cannot vote on personnel matters. So I suggested that they have a conversation with us and with the school board and the CEO to talk about what we would think would be possible. I also met with Joe Kane from PCAB, the Parent Community Advisory Board. Unfortunately, his other members could not meet. We just discussed mostly about the state budget and the school system budget and the extra expenses that we've had with the COVID. And also they were interested in maintaining the state's payment of the MTA transportation costs, which I'll get into a little later. I also met with Winifred Winston from CCAC, Special Education Citizens Advisory Committee, had a really big, robust conversation with her. We again talked about the budget on the state level as well as the local level, and she also thought there should be some money for assisted technology for the development of IEPs. Christian, next slide. So here are the major issues that I see, and then I'll go through them. I'll give a broad frame to them, and then I'll go through them individually. So, of course, the blueprint for Maryland's future, which implemented the Kerwin recommendations. After at least 3 years worth of meetings and developing legislation and having smaller pieces of the Kerwin legislation pass in previous years, we had a bill that passed last session that implemented a $2.8 billion overhaul of the educational system in Maryland. Unfortunately, we'll get into more details. This bill was vetoed by the governor, so we need to talk about next steps for potential override of this at the beginning of next session. And tied to the blueprint bill was the Built to Learn Act. This was school construction funding. It was a $2.2 billion school construction fund that was tied to blueprint, that Baltimore City would have received funding for that to build or renovate additional schools. And I'll get into more detail about that in the next slide. But once the Kerwin, i.e. blueprint bill was vetoed, the Built to Learn Act died with that veto. Also, of course, the budget, operating and capital, that's going to be, I think, the main focus of the entire session. I can't even imagine many legislative bills will pass out of committee and get to the floor until we get the budget straight. And that's going to be on funding formula modifications. We know every jurisdiction in the state, from what I'm hearing, has lost enrollment. And as you know, enrollment affects funding. We have our CIP. Also, the Bridge to Kerwin, I have a later slide about that. That was the additional funds the school system received over the last 3 years in order for us to move to Kerwin. It was funding to keep us going until we got Kerwin. And so now if we didn't have Kerwin, we need to revisit that. Also, broadband. I understand the Senate and House leadership are interested in doing something for digital access. The pandemic spotlighted things that people have been saying for years, that there is a lack of access to the internet and broadband. And as the CEO and the board chair and board members have said, digital access broadband should be something like a public utility, just like the phone. Next slide. So here we go into the specifics about the blueprint and built to learn. So when the governor vetoed the blueprint bill, he said it was because of the pandemic and the additional funding that would be needed in order to provide the appropriate PPE, all the other economic downturn that would occur because of the inability of businesses to open and operate this as they normally do. And so with that, he vetoed the blueprint bill. And when a governor vetoes a bill, in order for it to be overridden, at the immediate consideration at the next session has to occur, which means 3/5 of the House and 3/5 of the Senate membership need to vote to override that veto. Now, I think they're still counting their votes to determine about whether the veto will be overridden if there are enough votes. I think a lot of it falls on whether or not we will receive any economic relief from the federal government, how long COVID will continue, and I'll talk about that a little later. But even if we do override the veto for Kerwin, not only does it bring back the Built to Learn, which is the school construction funding bill, which Baltimore City would have gotten about $420 million, which I think we wanted to focus on high schools, but we would still need to have some sort of changes to the blueprint bill because there's many modifications needed to the implementation dates. It was a 10-year plan. They may end up starting the phase-in later. They may end up extending the phase-in. It all depends on the budget situation of the state. Next slide. So then we get into the budget. So right now, from the last Board of Revenue estimates and the Department of Legislative Services flagged that the state has a budget gap for FY22, which is the budget year that we will be considering in the upcoming legislative session, anywhere from a $1.6 billion to a $2.6 billion budget gap. That's big. The federal government, again, we don't know if there's going to be any relief from the federal government. But also for Baltimore City, the issue of the declining enrollment is even greater because not only did we lose enrollment, which will affect our bottom line for general funding, but if you recall, the last 2 years, the governor provided what I called a hold harmless to Baltimore City. So for FY19, we got an additional $11 million, and FY20, I think it was $7 million or $7.6 million, something like that, in order to, along with our declining enrollment grant, to keep us whole. So here we are now in a pandemic where we have lack of enrollment or declining enrollment, and we still also will probably need that hold harmless to keep us whole if Kerwin doesn't pass. So I just wanted to let everyone know that it's sort of a little more dire for Baltimore City. Also, you should know that the legislature set aside $370 million for FY22 to implement Kerwin, but that $370 million is at the discretion of the governor. He could use that money, and through the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, which is a bill that he could introduce, he could use that money to then supplant some education funding or some other funding that may be missing in other areas. So a lot of it, again, still depends on how the economic situation looks come next year or the early part of next year and what the federal government does. Again, as I said, funding is tied to enrollment, not only just for our operating budget, but also there's some capital programs that look at funding too. And we've been talking amongst ourselves about a statewide solution, meaning a actual legislation that we've been looking at, trying to figure out how to word it so that we could have some relief on that. And I think it's also a great advantage that Delegate McIntosh is chair of appropriations. And then we also have the Senate president from Baltimore City too. So they're well aware of all these issues. One thing the state board did do to help alleviate some of the funding was to allow those kids that had not been immunized to be counted in funding. Prior to this, if you did not provide your immunization proof by a certain date, you weren't included in operating funds. The state board allowed this for this 1 year for funding purposes, which makes me believe that the governor is also trying to figure out a way to mitigate some of the funding challenges, because this never would have happened if the governor wasn't aware. And in fact, I know his chief legislative officer said to me that the governor has been trying to figure out ways to help alleviate some of the funding struggles that school districts will have. What that looks like, I don't know. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier, Bridge to Kerwin. In 2018, we discovered that we had this potential $180 million budget deficit or budget gap. And so it wasn't a deficit, it was a gap that we projected. And so with a combination of the city and state, we received additional funding. As you see here, also the state picked up the transportation cost for MTA, which is set to expire after this school year. And so without Kerwin, we need to revisit at a minimum another bridge. And I'm hoping we can figure out a way to use Kerwin, but I can't imagine Kerwin's going to start in FY22. So we probably will need to have a bridge. And again, the advantage of having Delegate McIntosh and President Ferguson there is going to be a very big advantage for us in maintaining some of our funding. Next slide. So I also put this here because this is going to be quite an unusual year. I don't know if I said it earlier, in my 30 years of doing this, 20 years specific to Baltimore City, I've never seen anything like how we're going to have to operate in the General Assembly. I'm sure a lot of people are saying and seeing first throughout this pandemic. But unlike other years where you could just go and grab someone in the hall and talk to them, there's going to be limited access to the government buildings. It's going to be by appointment only. You may be able to do, you will be able to contact members virtually, but there's only so many hours in the day in order to do that. We're used to running around and grabbing people as you see them. That's not going to happen. They're going to live stream all bill hearings and committees and subcommittee hearings and briefings and voting sessions, which is nice, but it still it's still not better than actually being in the room. I know the Senate is planning for bill hearings to limit the number of people that testify at bill hearings. There's going to be no advocacy night, so that means we're not going to have people going to any of the rooms to have like Baltimore City Day or anything like that. The only advocacy that they will allow is outside, where you can have your rallies. They will still allow that because it's outside, but I'm sure there's still going to be some issues about social distancing with that. Bill files, they say, will be online, and we'll have to submit all of our written testimony online. Verbal testimony, like I said, the Senate's going to restrict it. The House, you sign up to testify virtually. And I still say it's all TBD, to be determined, because based on the surge that we're seeing now, anything can change, everything can change. And so it's going to be a very, very trying year to get to the people that we need to get to. And next slide. And so that's the overall of some of the major issues, not all the issues that I see, but I want to leave time for the public to address the board. The next step is a presentation in December for the board to approve the legislative platform, which will be more in detail. And unless you have questions, that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Yeah. Were there any questions from a board member before we open it to public comment? Okay. If not, then I'm going to ask Mr. Gann if he will lead us into the public comment with the folks who have signed up at this point.
Thank you, Chair Chinya, and thank you, Dewana. First, we have Ms. Labrina Hopkins and Crystal Cornish. Are you on?
Hello, yes. This is Labrina Hopkins. I'm on.
Okay, thank you. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Good evening, Board of School Commissioners. My name is Labrina Hopkins, and I'm both a parent of a Baltimore City Public Schools student and an IEP chair at National Academy Foundation. I'm also a proud member of the Baltimore Teachers Union, and I sit on the executive board for the American Federation of Teachers in Maryland. I address you today in the hopes of persuading the board to become proactive in Annapolis to ensure safe drinking water for children in Baltimore City public schools. The Maryland Association of Boards of Education, MABE, a lobbying organization of which this board is a member, has testified against legislation that would improve drinking water situations in Baltimore City schools. The organization lobbied against bills to lessen the actionable lead levels down to 5 from 20 points per billion, saying that it was unfair and potentially too expensive. Besides the fact that MABE's argument does not make sense in this context, because young children, the majority of the population in city schools, are more susceptible to the dangers of drinking water contaminated with lead than the general public. More concerning to me is that this board, after knowing the history of the problems with lead and the drinking water that are particular to our school system, would allow MABE to make this argument on city schools' behalf. Not only are Baltimore City schools the oldest in the state and thus more susceptible to having old pipes and fixtures that cause elevated levels of lead in the water, but we learned through testimony that the EPA knew about elevated levels of lead as far back as 1988. But the information wasn't made available to the public until 2001. Both AFT Maryland and the Baltimore Teachers Union have for years consistently testified in favor of and lobbied for legislation to improve the drinking water situation in Baltimore City schools. Unfortunately, Baltimore City Schools has not yet been a willing partner with us in this effort. As recently as last year, bills were introduced that would lower the threshold from what constitutes actionable levels of lead in drinking water to 5 parts per billion. No amount of lead in the drinking water is safe for children whose minds are still developing. AFT Maryland and the Baltimore Teachers Union submitted testimony in support of this bill, and Jeremy Beeling, a Baltimore City teacher, a science teacher, testified in person to this bill. Lead in the drinking water has historically been a problem in Baltimore City schools. It's unconscionable to me that this board would allow MABE to make this argument on their behalf against this bill. Montgomery County's Board of Education went against MABE in their opposition to last year's bill, and Baltimore County's board already took steps to lower that threshold to 5 parts per billion.
Ms. Hopkins, you're out of time, so you can wrap up your last thought.
Okay, so in closing, I just wanted to say that we would like the support of Baltimore City Public Schools and this board and to helping us with legislation to lower the parts per billion of lead in water. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next, we have a video from Mr. Zachary Taylor. Oh, great. Video went away. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, can everybody see the screen?
Good evening. The PTO agrees with many of the issues the district is prioritizing this legislative session. As longstanding partners in fighting for fair funding, we need veto overrides for the blueprint legislation and for the Build to Learn Act, as well as formula fixes, hold harmless protections, and so on. And of course, we need to close the digital divide. But tonight, we want to highlight 2 items we haven't heard from city schools on: mold in our school buildings and lead in our schools' water. Last session, there were bills that would require inspections and reports for the presence of mold hazards in schools. There were also bills that would lower the amount of acceptable lead in Maryland schools' water supply from 20 parts per billion to 5 parts per billion. We call on city schools to support this legislation with its own testimony, as well as with the organizations that speak on its behalf. City Schools is a member of the Maryland Association of Boards of Education, also known as MABE, and our current board chair sits on MABE, and last year City Schools had a commissioner serve as the president of MABE. However, MABE has at times taken positions that are not in the best interest of students, and in fact, puts them directly at risk. MABE was against strengthening mold and lead protections in Maryland, and City Schools did not speak on either of these issues directly. However, we saw some school districts do that. Montgomery County and PG County spoke in favor of these bills. We need city schools to do the same. Air quality is an extremely important issue for the health and development of young children, and mold poses a variety of risks to some of our most vulnerable populations. Likewise, the dangers of lead as a neurotoxin are well known, and reducing the acceptable amounts of lead by 75% would have extremely beneficial consequences. In fact, improving poor air quality and reducing lead in water are measures that have much more data supporting their positive effects on student achievement than do the latest tweaks in teacher evaluation policies or shifts from one standardized test to a different one. In short, we know that providing a safe and healthy learning environment is not just the right thing to do, it also boosts student achievement. For decades, our schools have actively contributed to lead poisoning its own students through water fountains that had incredibly high levels of lead. While most of our schools now have their fountains off, we know that in some of our schools where the fountains are still on, they still have levels of lead above 20 parts per billion, as we can see in the reports issued by the Maryland Department of the Environment. How many more schools have fountains with above 5 parts per billion? This legislation would allow us to find out and fix the problems, as many other counties have. As our school district has recently focused on measures regarding health and safety, we need to make sure that they're fighting for these protections against lead and mold. We need city schools to show up, to speak up, and to use its influence in MABE to get it to protect our students. We ask that this be part of your legislative platform. Thank you.
Oh, Commissioner James, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Gant. I'd just like to comment to clarify for folks the difference in a legislative platform between MABE and a local district. So the internal conversations within MABE is no one within MABE is in favor of poisoning young people. What MABE does is they take a legislative position that ensures that there is local control. So rather than saying that the state level should make a decision that should be then imposed on every LEA, MABE's default position is that we want to support the local LEAs in doing what's best for each of them individually. So you are absolutely right, both of the previous speakers, to flag this as something that you want Baltimore City to advocate for. The challenge is, and I just want to help you understand, that MABE is not advocating for lead poisoning. MABE is not advocating for lower restrictions. What MABE is advocating for is each local LEA to make their best decisions. So this is the space where we hear from you, and then we as Baltimore City may choose to take actions similar to other jurisdictions in the past and advocate for that, or against that, or for any other issue. But just to understand that MABE as an overarching body stands at the fundamental position of supporting the decisions that individual boards make and individuals' communities need. So I hope that helps clarify that just a piece. And then I also just really appreciate and welcome the flag about lead in the water and about safety of our students, because certainly that's something that's important to us as board of commissioners. Thank you, Mr. Gant.
Thank you, Commissioner James. Commissioner Bondima?
Yes, I'd just like to, I represent Baltimore City Public Schools at MABE, and I will guarantee you for sure that we're always on the plus side watching over Baltimore City as far as lead is concerned. I am one of the advocates to encourage us to do what we need to do to resolve that issue. So always remember, I want the public to remember that we're on top of it, and we surely will be looking after the best interests of our community and our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Bondema. Any other comments before we continue on? Okay. Our next comment is a video from Ms. Franca Mueller-Paz.
Hi, my name is Franca Mueller-Paz. I'm a building representative for the Baltimore Teachers Union, an advisor for SONOS, and a teacher at Baltimore City College. Since this pandemic began, our school district has been at the mercy of the goodwill of Comcast, a company whose functional high-speed service is out of reach for many of our families and staff, and whose Internet Essentials program for low-income families falls far short of the service they need for a 21st century education. Yet despite the advocacy of students, teachers, educational advocates, politicians, and the school district, Comcast routinely comes up short for our kids. As the third wave of COVID rises, it is clear distance learning and its impact on education as we know it will be with us for the foreseeable future. And the need for internet speed that we have today will not disappear even after the storm of COVID-19 is past. So instead of waiting for a multinational, multi-billion-dollar company to do the right thing, we must work together to find another way to get Baltimoreans online. And the first step, joining the Maryland Association of Counties in supporting Broadband Accessibility Act of 2021. This year, the Maryland Association of Counties has taken up broadband as one of the association's 4 priorities for the 2021 Maryland General Assembly session. This act will ensure rural and urban areas alike, like Baltimore City, receive needed resources to build out their high-speed broadband access. To this day, our city is the victim of digital redlining. From Sandtown to Cherry Hill and beyond, there are areas of our city that internet service providers have determined it is not worth their investment to build out functional internet infrastructure. And that's why I'm asking Baltimore City schools to be champions in advocating for our youth and push the Maryland General Assembly to step up for our kids, where these private for-profit companies have fallen desperately short. Baltimore residents today face a comparable challenge to what rural Americans faced a century ago. In the 1930s, millions across rural America lived without electricity, a lack of infrastructure that hurt both people, education, and the economy. In response to this inaction from private power companies that falsely claimed extending coverage would be unprofitable to them, sound familiar? An activist government stepped up. The Rural Electrification Administration under Franklin D. Roosevelt brought light, power, and a place in the 20th century economy to the United States. 2 decades into the 21st century, our kids and communities still struggle. This time with access to the internet, a basic necessity and a human right as defined by the United Nations. If we do not solve this problem, we face an educational deficit that will affect our city's children for years to come, especially in a city where 1 in every 2 Black and Latinx households lack access to adequate broadband internet. I hope you will consider taking up this important fight for our city's families. Thank you.
Okay, and our final sign up for public comment comes from Ms. Samreen Sherez representing SOMOS, and it's a video.
Hi, my name is Samreen Shiraz, and I'm a junior in Baltimore City College.
And I'm Samar Khwaja, a student in Baltimore City College.
And I'm Ian Lesko, a junior at Baltimore City College.
We represent SOMOS, Students Organizing a Multicultural Open Society. SOMOS is a student-led organization that tackles systemic issues of injustice in schools. That is why we want Baltimore City Schools to join Maryland Association of Counties in fighting for the Broadband Accessibility Act of 2021 during the upcoming legislative session. According to the component, According to the Maryland Association of Counties, affordable high-speed internet is an essential component of counties' economic development, while a lack of reliable broadband is a major barrier to socioeconomic opportunity, health, education, and quality of life.
Students are being systematically denied to exercise their constitutional right to an education because they aren't getting the internet they need to stay online. In a recent article by Maryland Matters, they noted that Baltimore lags behind the rest of the country when it comes to internet access at home, according to a recent report by Apple Foundation. That report showed that gaps in at-home internet access exist along racial lines in Baltimore, while 73% of white households in the city have access to broadband at home. Only 50.2% of the black households and 46.4% of Hispanic households do. That means that in our city, only 1 in every 2 black and Latinx residents and likely students don't have access to broadband internet. The majority of SONOS members report frequently getting kicked off of their classes, difficulty communicating and understanding their teachers due to poor signals, and problems uploading assignments.
I have classmates who are often unable to join calls for group projects because their internet isn't working. There have been times when I've been in the middle of taking a test in multiple classes, my internet has just completely shut down in all of my house. This creates not only a problem for me, but also my sister, who is also a BCTSS student at Poly, who also needs to get her schoolwork done as well.
Many of my classmates are getting kicked off their classes due to the internet. This is very harmful for the education of these students and gets in their way of their successful future. I also have siblings who also share the same internet connection as me. Sometimes the internet shuts down for all of us and causes us to miss parts of class and to be late in submitting our work on time.
It's hard for me to use the internet when it's being used on 3 or more devices in my household. Because of the load of the internet, websites take time to load, which causes assignments to be submitted late and causes interference in our classes, which makes it hard for me to understand what the teacher is trying to teach us.
According to the United Nations, having access to high-speed, reliable internet is a basic human right. As we begin to approach and prepare for the Maryland General Session, it is crucial that BCPSS fight for the internet Baltimore students need and deserve for a 21st century education, especially during a global pandemic. Thank you.
Okay, Madam Chair, back to you.
Okay, I want to thank the folks who have spoken to us this evening. I guess I'm open to see if there are any additional comments from any of the board members. Sometimes when we're in person, we can see other folks to continue, but if we have reached the end of the folks who've signed up, unless we have some other comments, I think we will be ending our meeting this evening early. Any of the commissioners wish to respond to anything that you've heard from the comments or add anything? Okay. Well, I'm going to say thank you. I know one of the areas that was brought up is definitely we saw as an issue that was presented around broadband, just to let folks know that the school board has participated in hearings and conversations with both our city council and other legislative representatives about the importance of broadband as a part of our push towards equity, as well as the general need for the community and for students as well as staff. And so we will continue with that. And I want to thank the folks who brought up the issue around the water and mold, and as both of our representatives are serving on May, I'm certain to continue as a system to look at those safety and health issues, and we will definitely be advocates in terms of protecting the health and safety of our students and their families and our staff. So with those two, I want to say thank you again to everyone who has joined us. Thank you, Ms. Durrett, for the presentation. If there are other ideas or comments that you would like to make, we would offer the opportunity that you send those in to the board office, and we will read those and consider them as we are preparing. As was stated, the board will be coming back in December for the final decision around what our legislative platform will be. Dr. Santelises, did you want to add anything this evening before we end?
You're on mute. You're still on mute, Madam CEO. No.
Can't hear you. Okay.
It is a little laggy. It's a little laggy tonight, at least for me as well. I don't know if it's laggy for other people.
No, we can't hear you.
Okay. So I think we are highlighting the need for us to really push in terms of the internet as we continue with our online and virtual meetings and instruction. We'll let that be our closing note. Again, thank you for being with us this evening, and everyone, please be safe and have a good night. And this meeting will end for the evening. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.